Ron, thank you very much for your praise. I really appreciate it. Let me begin by thanking both of our hosts for convening this conference. First, Andrew, Mary at the International Center for Jefferson Studies, thank you. You should be commended for elucidating Thomas Jefferson's timeless political relevance, including on our topic today. One could never say that Jefferson actively promoted democracy abroad, and you certainly wouldn't call him a neoconservative. But the fact remains that he offered advice to Russia's Tsar and Greek reformers in liberalizing their countries. Most strikingly, Jefferson welcomed his old friend Lafayette to his Paris Hôtel de Langeac residence to help him draft the Declaration on the Rights of Man. At IRI, my old institute, as Ron mentioned, foreign opposition leaders often asked about Jefferson, and they often came here to Monticello to visit for inspiration. And at the State Department, I frequently watched Colin Powell, in meetings with new liberalizing presidents and prime ministers, cite Jefferson's second inaugural advice on dealing with the press. Thanks also to the American Academy of Diplomacy, which does such excellent work supporting and strengthening our conduct of foreign policy. I'm very flattered to be a member, and I'm honored to be asked to speak today. It's humbling to follow distinguished diplomats like Nick Veliotis and Bob Beecroft, Pete Romero and Dick Miles, with whom I had the honor to work, and of course the always wise Ron Newman. One person I wish was with us today is Larry Eagleburger. Larry retired near here, and he worked with the Wilson Center, or the Miller Center down at UVA. For those of you who didn't know him, he was an extremely skilled diplomat who rose to become the first ex-Foreign Service officer to become Secretary of State at the end of the Bush 41 administration. He had cut his chops as a top aide to Henry Kissinger, and as you can probably imagine, he was therefore very much from the realist school of foreign policy. I got to work with him when I was a very young Deputy Assistant Secretary. And then he was also, as I was mentioning to Ron, on my board at the International Republican Institute, but he was a realist. So in 2001, I phoned him to let him know I was leaving IRI to return to the State Department. Larry asked which bureau I would be joining. I'm going to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I said, my chest swelling with pride. There was a silence. Then Larry, the realist, said, well, I'm not sure they should have that bureau. Another moment of silence. Then he added, but if they do, you're the right person to lead it. Those of you who knew him better can tell me whether that was a compliment or not. I've never been sure. I did try to be the right person to lead the bureau, which is called DRL. I'm going to refer to it as DRL from now on. It's not the most beloved bureau in the department. There are many reasons for that. Among them, the belief of one of my predecessors that DRL should be an NGO at state. I had just come from leading an NGO, and I didn't quite see the point of doing that all over again. I was happy to maintain my bureau's, within the department, they would say, moaning reputation. For example, by ensuring the accuracy of the annual human rights reports. But I thought it important for DRL to go beyond a once-a-year day in the sun and to contribute more actively to melding values and interests in American diplomacy. That became especially relevant after 9/11. I began my post there about 2 months before 9/11. After 9/11, we dealt more intensely with any number of autocrats, elected and otherwise, in places from Vietnam to Azerbaijan. I never objected to that. I never agreed with those who say we should refuse to talk with such governments. Completely isolating them may be morally satisfying to some, but it's not pragmatic. It means missing information important to our national security and that of our allies. It also means missing opportunities to encourage change and abandoning those who most need our help. Such engagement needn't occur at the highest levels. Under John Foster Dulles, for example, we began 15 years of dialogue with China through our ambassadors in Warsaw. In short, we can't allow a meritorious concern for democracy and human rights abroad to trump our other interests. That said, as the number 3 at the department when I was there under Powell, under Secretary Mark Grossman, often put it after 9/11, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We pursued our national security interests, even as we pushed for greater political openness abroad. And I could cite many, many examples, but let me mention a few in the career foreign service. I think of a man named Ambassador John Herbst, who in the fall of 2001 secured critical basing rights in Uzbekistan to be able to service our troops in Afghanistan, even as he sought successfully to free political prisoners and cleave open political space. Or Ambassadors John O'Keefe and Steve Young, who ensured Kyrgyzstan's again crucial basing cooperation, even as they encouraged those who would open the country's political system. All understood that sustainable democracy over the last half century has involved the pursuit of our national interests and our principles in a balanced way. When we have not, when we have placed too much emphasis on one over the other, our interests can suffer, as I would argue they did under President Carter, or a lack of public support can make our foreign policy more difficult to execute, as I think Henry Kissinger learned as he was fighting Jackson-Vanik legislation. The autocrats of the countries I've mentioned so far, Vietnam, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, were not then elected right after 9/11. So one of the questions today is, should the U.S. accept autocratic practices from elected leaders? It will not surprise you to hear that my answer is no, but rather than lecture you about the valid moral reasons why, consider occasions when our democratically elected government has received counsel from other democracies. Mary Dudziak's excellent book, Cold War Civil Rights, Race and the Image of American Democracy, cites Secretary of State Dean Acheson writing in 1947, "The existence of discrimination against minority groups in this country has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. We are reminded over and over by some foreign newspapers and spokesmen that our treatment of various minorities leaves much to be desired." And then Acheson concludes, "We will have much better international relations when these reasons for suspicion and resentment have been removed." 17 years later, our continued civil rights struggle occasioned Norway's Nobel Committee to give the 1964 Peace Prize to Martin Luther King. And I needn't go back half a century to find examples. I doubt that any of us who served in the Bush 43 administration escaped advice from other democracies on issues from Abu Ghraib to Guantanamo. Our fellow democracies believed we had fallen short not only of the high standards they expected of the United States, but also in terms of our adherence to internationally accepted norms. If liberal democracies are justified in offering advice to other liberal democracies that have an established rule of law, freedom of the press, a civil society, and open elections, then we should certainly be willing, as needed and appropriate, to do so with the types of countries we were discussing earlier today. In what were at the time electoral democracies, countries with elections but only a nascent rule of law, press freedoms, and civil society, Putin, Milosevic, I would argue Morsi, and Chavez all initially came to power in relatively free and fair balloting, but all quickly moved to close their country's nascent judicial, political, and press space. Being freely elected does not make an autocrat a democrat. And an autocrat, even one freely elected, is unlikely to curb his tendencies once in office. A recent study of such countries termed their systems competitive authoritarianism. You've already heard the skillful approaches that Nick, Bob, Pete, and Dick used to meld our dealings and interest into effective policies in such environments. And as Ron put it, there is no easy answer on this question. For those of you who are thinking of a career in diplomacy, let me relate 7 best practices I've seen in approaching leaders with popular support in countries where we have vital interests. First, make approaches to them on reform and on our interests a multilateral thing, not an American thing. The effect of Washington asking for something is increased when other countries do the same, and on reform in particular is augmented if the neighboring countries join the chorus. Multilateral approaches, especially if neighbors join in, appeal to a ruler's desire for legitimacy. On reform issues, they also demonstrate to a supportive public that their country is out of step with international and neighborhood norms. Similarly, in offering models of reform, don't use the United States. Use more recent transitions in places like Slovakia or Mongolia or El Salvador. Second, while our body politic often demands it, and as Dick Miles, I think, intimated this morning, it's wise, at least initially, to avoid public criticism, especially when an authoritarian has fairly robust political support. Secretary of State James Baker called his memoir The Politics of Diplomacy. A lot of people asked him, why did you name a book on your time as Secretary of State, Politics of Diplomacy? Here's what he said. The people you're across the table from, they have got to do the very same thing you'd have to do. No foreign policy is going to be sustainable that doesn't have a firm grounding in domestic politics, and he was talking about our country and the countries we deal with, and doesn't have a firm domestic consensus behind it. Public critiques can embarrass a leader at home and may tempt him to play the martyr, usually against the Western powers. Quiet diplomacy enables a foreign leader to make a more considered calculation about change in their country. If the change doesn't come, public critiques can always be made later. Third, carefully modulate the scope and intensity of relations, including aid, senior-level exchanges, and sanctions, depending on the progress in our interests and on reform issues. I've heard former Obama administration officials say it was a mistake to front-load relations with Burma, which received cabinet and presidential level visits before much sustainable change had been made. A better approach, I think, was taken, though admittedly not on democracy issues, with Vietnam in the 1990s, and some of my old colleagues here will remember this, in the 1990s lead up to normalization. There we devised what we called a roadmap to elicit cooperation on accounting for MIAs, the servicemen who had been lost in Vietnam. That successful approach linked step-by-step intensified relations to step-by-step increased cooperation from Hanoi in accounting for our servicemen. I think this has appeal in authoritarian countries, in part because their leaders tend to be transactional, not least in their dealings to stay in power. It also demonstrates to a ruler's supportive populace that better economic and political relations can be had with the outside world if their government is flexible, creating additional good pressure. I was pleased, for example, to see the Obama administration continue the Millennium Challenge Corporation because I think it provides similar transparent incentives for political, economic, and social reforms. Fourth, go beyond the chief executive and foreign ministry and engage widely with the host government. Those entities may understand dealing on our interests and the need for reform, but the Interior and Justice Ministries, for example, which I think Pete mentioned, which often crave international legitimacy, can be critical to implementing reform. It's also a useful way to find individual reformers in the bureaucracy for when change begins to accelerate. For slightly different reasons, the leader's family should be engaged. They can often be an impediment to, and occasionally a subtle agent for reform, especially if educated in the West. In encouraging reform with autocratic presidents, ministers, or family members, I've more than once, as Dick Miles intimated this morning, more than once seen appeals to their vanity, helping them imagine how furthering reform would assure their place in history. I've seen that move things along. Fifth, we need to refocus on helping to build simultaneously the institutions that can bring orderly reform to democracies. In addition to political competition, the rule of law, civil society, the media, and other sectors. We've had a number of fads in democracy assistance, starting in the 1980s with pushing for elections, which is why even autocrats feel compelled to hold balloting exercises, sham and otherwise, to lay their claim to legitimacy. It's true that one never knows which jailed dissident will be the next Nelson Mandela or Lech Walesa, but making the welfare of a particular individual or group in a country the predominant barometer of improvements in human rights and democracy means we're not focusing as much attention on helping build the institutions which can ultimately bring dignity, justice, and respect to all. I've rarely run across a country where people don't want more of those freedoms, but I'm seeing more and more countries where the autocratic leader claims to a supportive public to be a bulwark against Western cultural values. Vladimir Putin is having some success with this in Russia and in appealing to countries from Uganda to China to form a united front on that basis. Sixth, I mentioned wide engagement before. The difference between a diplomat who knew change was coming to an authoritarian country and those who didn't, and I can cite examples of both, is largely dependent on how wide and deep their contacts range. That's become more difficult, as we were reminded yesterday, because of logarithmically growing security concerns due to attacks on our diplomatic facilities. But in the many countries with a growing middle class with access to technology, it's vital to reach beyond the capital-based elites to those outside the current administration. Indigenous and foreign NGOs can also be helpful intermediary sources of information in this regard. Finally, as some of you know, I left IRI last year after 2 terms totaling 16 years as its president. We had some cardinal rules for our democracy assistant work, like it's their country, not ours, and it's their struggle, not ours. I won't go through them all, but the final rule I used to tell my staff is relevant. In doing such work, I said that they had to have a very un-American virtue. It's called patience. It takes a lot longer to help build a democracy than it does to write a magazine article about it. Americans tend to have a short attention span. If after 3 years and a few $100 million, they're not acting like us, we can get bored and find new targets for our affections. I call this country of the year syndrome. I used to tell autocrats that we were a lot less interested in where they started the reform process than that they were moving forward. Patience can't be an excuse for inaction or foot dragging, and reform can be catalyzed by seeing the successes and the mistakes of other democracies. But we need to recognize when a country begins to institute democratic practices that they won't overnight become, to borrow a phrase, a Jeffersonian democracy. I'm sure that 240 years ago, Mr. Jefferson had no idea that our country would still be striving to achieve the ideals he championed. Let me again thank our hosts for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.